The morning sun rose over the Philippine peninsula with a cruel indifference. Its light was not soft or forgiving. It burned down like fire on the rolling hills and mangled ridges of Bataan. For months, American and Filipino soldiers had held the line against the relentless advance of the Japanese Imperial Army. They were exhausted, sick, starving, and yet unbroken. For many, the hope of holding Bataan was more than strategy. It was survival, honor, and the belief that America would not abandon them. By early April 1942, that hope was fading. The defenders had endured months of siege, bombardment, and isolation. Food stores were gone. Rice had been reduced to handfuls, boiled with leaves and scraps to feed the hungry men. Water was rationed, often contaminated, and malaria spread like wildfire through the trenches and foxholes. Dysentery claimed dozens daily, weakening even the strongest. Soldiers who had once marched and fought with pride now shuffled through mud and dust, gaunt faces sunken and hollow-eyed. On the ridges of Mount Samat and along the Pawikan River, soldiers clutched their rifles not with confidence, but with desperation. Each day was a battle for mere existence. Ammunition ran low, artillery was silenced one by one, and the skies were dominated by Japanese bombers and fighter planes. Their roars and explosions were constant reminders that the empire of the rising sun was relentless, methodical, and cruelly efficient. General Edward King, Jr., commander of the Luzon force, faced the impossible. His troops were exhausted, the wounded overwhelming the small medical teams, the civilian population suffering in silence behind the lines. Attempts to resupply had failed. Communications with Corregidor, the last Allied stronghold on the island, had grown sporadic. Hope was no longer a strategy. It was a luxury they could not afford. Across the peninsula, Japanese forces advanced with terrifying precision. Soldiers in crisp uniforms moved through the jungle like shadows, guided by maps and intelligence gathered from local collaborators. They were disciplined, experienced from campaigns in China, hardened by months of fighting and indoctrination that taught them to see their enemies as less than human. To the Japanese commanders, the defenders of Bataan were obstacles to be removed, obstacles that would learn obedience only through suffering. By April 9th, the inevitable became reality. General King, exhausted, informed his commanders that further resistance was futile. The decision to surrender was not made lightly. It was a choice between the slow destruction of his men by hunger, disease, and bullets, or the unknown horrors of captivity. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were about to become prisoners of war, the largest surrender of American forces in history. The news traveled slowly, carried along the lines in whispers. Some men wept openly, some cursed the higher command, others sat quietly, staring at the rising sun, trying to steel themselves for what was to come. The soldiers understood that surrender in war was not simply giving up, it was stepping into an abyss with no guarantees. Japanese officers moved swiftly to enforce discipline. The disarmament was brutal and systematic. Rifles, pistols, knives, and personal items were confiscated. Soldiers were ordered to strip down to their underwear. Watches, boots, and even water bottles were seized. Each act stripped them of not only possessions, but dignity. The captives were no longer men of an army. They were property, a living testament to Japanese victory. As columns formed along dusty roads and trails, the first steps of what would become the Bataan Death March began. The terrain was unforgiving. Hills climbed under the weight of exhaustion, rivers crossed with swollen waters from the early April rains, and jungles closed in around them, thick with mosquitoes and the stench of decay. The Japanese guards marched beside them, rifles at the ready, bayonets gleaming, eyes cold and unflinching. The heat of the sun was relentless. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men stumbled, fainted, or collapsed outright. Those who could not rise were beaten with rifle butts or stabbed without hesitation. It became immediately clear that this march was not merely a transfer of prisoners, It was a test of endurance and a demonstration of absolute power. Any faltering step could mean death. Along the road, soldiers encountered the first casualties, comrades who had survived months of siege, malnutrition, and illness now fell to exhaustion. Some cried out for water or help. Some did not cry at all. Those who paused to aid the fallen were themselves struck. Compassion became a risk, mercy a death sentence. The Japanese guards enforced order with an unflinching brutality designed to break the will as well as the body. Despite the horror, fragments of courage and camaraderie persisted. Filipino and American soldiers supported one another, sharing what little water they could steal, offering encouragement when despair threatened to consume them. Whispered prayers, quiet songs, and murmured encouragement became lifelines in a landscape dominated by death. These small acts of humanity were invisible to their captors but vital to survival. The march stretched on, each mile blurred into the next under the sun, the hills, and the dense jungle canopy. Soldiers hallucinated, their minds strained by heat, dehydration, and hunger. Some saw visions of home, others relived battles they had fought months before. The physical agony was matched by mental torment. Every step forward was a reminder of failure, of surrender, of the absence of hope. The Japanese command, meanwhile, documented the march. Photographs were taken, sometimes to showcase victory, sometimes as propaganda. The prisoners, already reduced to shadows, were paraded like trophies, yet the reality of suffering could not be sanitized. The photos captured faces hollowed by hunger, eyes clouded with fever, bodies trembling under the weight of exhaustion. They were a record not of triumph, but of terror. By the second day, the scale of the tragedy became apparent. Men who had once been strong and disciplined were now crawling along the roadside, dragged by comrades who refused to leave them behind. Flies swarmed the corpses, vultures circled above, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn bringing another mile, another death, another act of endurance. At Mariveles, where the march began, local civilians tried to offer water and food to the passing column. The Japanese guards forbade it. Those caught assisting were beaten or executed. Acts of kindness became clandestine, whispered in the shadows, passed in secret from hand to hand. Humanity persisted, but only in fragments, hidden from the brutality surrounding it. For the soldiers, the march was more than a physical ordeal. It was a psychological crucible. Men who had trained, fought, and survived the siege of Bataan now confronted the ultimate test, the will to continue when every instinct screamed to give up. They learned to ration water from leaves, to share scraps of rice, to lift comrades too weak to walk alone. Every small act of endurance became a statement of defiance against the forces that sought to dehumanize them. As the sun set on the first day of the march, the prisoners lay wherever they could. Some collapsed in mud, others beneath trees too weak to move. Japanese guards patrolled relentlessly, ensuring no one rested too long, ensuring the suffering continued. The nights were humid, the air heavy with the smell of sweat, smoke from distant fires, and the decay of those who had already died. Sleep, if it came, was fitful and brief. The journey was far from over. Ahead lay the long stretch to San Fernando, and then another leg to Camp O'Donnell. The soldiers did not yet know what awaited them, but instinct whispered a terrifying truth. Survival would be measured not in miles, but in endurance under unimaginable suffering. Even in these first hours, a grim pattern emerged. Those who fell were left by the side of the road. Others were executed for faltering. The line between life and death had narrowed to a breath, a heartbeat, a single step. Men learned to push beyond exhaustion, to ignore pain, to step over the bodies of comrades, because stopping meant death. Amid the horror, the human spirit endured. Quiet acts of resistance, sharing water, supporting a fallen comrade, whispering encouragement, persisted in defiance of the cruelty surrounding them. These acts were small, almost invisible, but they became the threads of survival, binding men together against a force that sought to strip them of everything. The sun rose again on April 10th. The column continued, stretching along dusty roads, climbing hills, wading through streams, enduring heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Each day was a repetition of the last, yet each step carried the weight of history. The Bataan Death March had begun, a march that would etch itself into memory, a testament to cruelty and to endurance alike. The soldiers of Bataan were no longer just prisoners, they were witnesses to the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. And as the first miles of the road claimed lives, as the sun beat down mercilessly, and as despair threatened to consume them, one truth became clear. This was not just a march, it was a trial, a crucible, and only those with unbroken will would survive to tell the story. The tropical sun was merciless, burning down on the endless line of prisoners that snaked along the dust-choked road. April 10th, 1942, the day after surrender. The jungle shimmered with heat, its beauty mocking the suffering of the tens of thousands now trudging north from Mariveles. They had no food, no water, and no hope. Their canteens had been confiscated, their belongings looted, their humanity stripped away. Japanese soldiers patrolled the sides of the road, rifles glinting in the sun, bayonets ready. For them, this was not a march, it was a parade of shame. The defeated Americans and Filipinos were proof of Japan's new dominance in Asia. To the captors, mercy was weakness, discipline was absolute. Anyone who slowed down, who stumbled, who dared to speak out of turn, was struck or shot. The road soon became littered with corpses. The first to die were those already sick, men weakened by malaria and dysentery. They collapsed silently, their faces pressed into the dirt. Some tried to help them, but a single glance from a Japanese guard froze them in place. The punishment for compassion was death. A soldier who stopped to aid a friend might be bayoneted on the spot. And so the column marched on, leaving the fallen behind, their bodies baking under the Philippine sun. One survivor later said, "The hardest part wasn't the hunger or thirst, it was watching men you loved die and not being allowed to help." The march was supposed to be orderly, but chaos reigned. The Japanese guards were exhausted and furious, veterans of brutal campaigns in China, hardened by years of propaganda that dehumanized their enemies. To them, the prisoners were not soldiers, they were inferior, dishonorable, insects to be driven. When prisoners collapsed, the guards sometimes forced the survivors to bury them, using only their hands to dig shallow graves. Other times, the dead were left where they fell, stripped of boots or canteens by the desperate still alive. Water became an obsession. The marchers passed rivers and wells, but anyone who broke ranks to drink was beaten or bayoneted. Some risked it anyway, throwing themselves into muddy ditches, gulping water mixed with blood and decay. Others cupped their hands to catch the rain when dark clouds finally rolled in, only for the guards to laugh and push them back into the line. For every mile, the jungle seemed to close in tighter, as if nature itself was suffocating the men. Flies swarmed around open wounds, the air thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and rot. At night, they slept on the road. No shelter, no blankets, no food. Some tried to crawl into the brush, seeking rest or escape, but gunshots quickly ended any illusion of freedom. Among the prisoners, discipline dissolved. The march blurred into a nightmare without time or order. Soldiers who once wore crisp uniforms now looked like skeletons in rags. Men hallucinated, seeing water where there was none, hearing voices calling them home. Some sang to stay sane. Others prayed, their voices trembling in the dark. At one point, near the town of Balanga, a group of prisoners managed to steal coconuts from a nearby tree. When the guards discovered it, they forced the entire group to line up. Each man was ordered to dig his own grave. The coconuts lay scattered nearby, still green and unbroken. When the digging stopped, rifle shots echoed through the trees. The guards left the bodies half buried in the mud, a warning to the rest. By the fifth day, the road was lined with the dead. Trucks occasionally passed, filled with Japanese officers smoking and laughing, their eyes hidden behind the gleam of their caps. They looked down on the column as if observing insects under glass. Some ordered photographers to capture the march of victory. The irony was cruel. Those images would one day become evidence of atrocity. Near San Fernando, the survivors were herded into a field. It was nightfall, and the air reeked of decay. The guards ordered the prisoners to sit shoulder to shoulder in the dirt, packed so tightly they could not move. Anyone who tried to stand was struck down. The cries of the wounded mingled with the groans of the dying. In the darkness, someone whispered the Lord's Prayer. Others followed, a broken chorus rising from thousands of throats. For a moment, even the guards fell silent. Then dawn came, and the march resumed. The final leg was worse. Trucks rumbled by carrying officers, but the prisoners were forced to walk barefoot on roads littered with shattered glass and sharp stones. The heat returned, fierce and unrelenting. One soldier described the road as a living hell that never ended. Men began to lose their minds, talking to ghosts, laughing uncontrollably, or simply walking off the road to collapse beneath a tree. Those who survived reached San Fernando after 6 days. There the nightmare took another form. Packed into metal boxcars meant for 40 men, 100 were crammed inside. The doors were slammed shut. No air, no water. The sun turned the boxcars into ovens. Men suffocated standing up, their bodies pressed together. When the doors finally opened hours later at Capas, the dead fell out like sacks of grain. From there, the survivors were forced to march again, the final stretch to Camp O'Donnell. It was supposed to be a prisoner of war camp. In truth, it was a mass grave waiting to happen. By the time the march ended, more than 10,000 men were dead, shot, bayoneted, starved, or left to die under the sun. For many, death was a release. For the living, survival brought only the beginning of another ordeal. The Bataan Death March was not a single act of cruelty, but a chain of suffering stretched across miles and days, each step soaked in heat, blood, and humiliation. The Japanese guards called it Shinryaku no Michi, the road of conquest. But for the men who endured it, it would forever be the road of death. As night fell over the camp gates, those still alive looked back toward the horizon where Bataan lay. Smoke still rose from the hills they had once defended. In their minds, they heard the voices of friends left behind, the echo of gunfire, the crash of waves against the beaches of Mariveles. They had fought for a promise, the defense of freedom, the brotherhood of arms, the belief that their suffering meant something. Now they could only hope that the world would one day remember. The march had ended. But the nightmare of Bataan was far from over. The gates of Camp O'Donnell groaned open with a sound like rusted bones, and the survivors of the Bataan Death March stumbled through in silence. What awaited them inside was not salvation, but a slower, more insidious death. The camp was little more than a collection of bamboo huts surrounded by barbed wire and filth. No medicine, no clean water, no mercy. The air was thick with the smell of disease and despair. For those who had endured the march, the nightmare had simply changed shape. Inside the camp, American and Filipino soldiers were separated, divided not by hatred, but by circumstance. The Japanese command gave them no supplies, no proper shelter. They slept in mud, shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by the moans of the dying. The guards watched from towers, rifles in hand, barking orders with the sharpness of metal striking stone. A prisoner who spoke too loudly, who stood without permission, might never be seen again. Every morning began the same way, a whistle, the shuffling of feet, the count of the dead. Bodies were dragged from the huts to shallow pits beyond the wire. Some were so light from starvation that 2 men could carry 3 at once. The tropical sun baked the corpses until they split open, the stench clinging to every breath. By the end of April, dozens were dying each day. By May, it was hundreds. Yet even here, among the dying, flickers of humanity remained. Men shared what little rice they were given, a handful each day, crawling with weevils. Filipino prisoners taught the Americans how to drink water from bamboo shoots, how to trap rats for food. Chaplains whispered prayers over the bodies at night, their voices trembling but unbroken. The guards, too, were trapped in their own madness. Many were young conscripts from rural Japan, hardened by indoctrination and fear. To show pity was to invite punishment from their own officers. Some beat prisoners without reason. Others stood apart, silent, their eyes betraying unease. The cruelty of the system had consumed them all. Among the prisoners, disease spread like wildfire. Dysentery turned the camp into a cesspool of infection. Men lined up before makeshift latrines that overflowed into the drinking wells. Their skin clung to their bones, their eyes hollow. Doctors, stripped of their instruments, used bamboo tubes as syringes, coconut shells as cups, and cloth torn from uniforms as bandages. They fought against malaria with prayers and salt water. They saved lives with words when medicine failed. Each night, when darkness fell, the camp grew eerily quiet. The jungle hummed beyond the fence, crickets, cicadas, and the distant howl of some unseen animal. For a moment, the war seemed far away. Then came the screams, someone beaten for stealing food, or the last breath of a man who couldn't hold on any longer. Some whispered to the dead, apologizing for not being able to help. Others stopped speaking altogether, their minds retreating into the only safe place left, their memories. A few tried to escape. Under the cover of rain, men slipped through the wire or crawled beneath the fence. Most were caught within days. The guards paraded their bodies in front of the others, leaving them tied to posts in the sun as warnings. But each attempt, even when it failed, kept hope alive. The dream of freedom had not yet died. Amid this hell, fragments of humanity endured. Prisoners carved crosses from scrapwood. Others scratched names and dates into the bamboo walls, leaving behind proof that they had existed. One soldier, delirious with fever, spent his final hours drawing the American flag in the dirt with his finger. Another, a Filipino nurse, gave his last bowl of rice to a stranger. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The war outside raged on, but inside Camp O'Donnell, time had lost meaning. Rain came, turning the ground into rivers of mud. The dead were buried beneath it, only for their graves to wash open again. The living waded through it, carrying buckets of contaminated water, their feet raw and bleeding. By June 1942, the camp had become an open graveyard. Of the 76,000 who began the march, nearly half were gone, killed by exhaustion, execution, or disease. The survivors were no longer soldiers, but ghosts wrapped in skin. Some prayed for liberation, others no longer believed in it. But something unexpected began to grow among them, not defiance, but unity. Americans and Filipinos, once separated by rank and nationality, now shared a single purpose: to keep each other alive. They told stories to distract from hunger. They sang quietly when the guards weren't listening. Old folk songs from home, hymns from churches they might never see again. In that broken harmony, a strange kind of strength took root. Then, one humid morning in late June, new orders arrived. The Japanese decided to transfer many prisoners to different camps, including Cabanatuan and Davao Penal Colony. For the men at O'Donnell, it was another cruel test, a second march, another road of suffering. Yet the transfers also meant that news of their survival would eventually reach the outside world. What began as a death march would, through whispers and letters smuggled out by locals, become a story too horrific to ignore. In one corner of the camp, an American chaplain wrote in a smuggled notebook, "We live on faith alone. We have nothing else left to trade. God grant that this suffering not be in vain." Not far from him, a Filipino medic, his body barely more than bone, tended to a soldier's infected leg. He had no bandages, no medicine, only a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. "Hold on," he whispered. "Hold on, my friend." The line between life and death had become so thin it was almost invisible. Madness crept quietly through the huts, men talking to ghosts, others convinced they were already dead. Some stared at the sky for hours, waiting for planes that never came. Yet even in their delirium, they refused to surrender what the march and the camp had tried to take, their dignity. By July, the rains had ended, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the thunder. Graves marked by bamboo crosses dotted the camp perimeter, each one a story cut short, a name fading into history. But among the survivors, whispers of hope began to stir. Rumors spread, American forces regrouping in Australia, radio messages hinting at counterattacks in the Pacific. Whether true or not didn't matter. Hope, however fragile, was a weapon. At dusk, as the sky burned red above the jungle, a prisoner named Private Ramon Santos sat beside a dying comrade. "Do you think anyone will remember us?" the man asked. Ramon hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "Someone will tell our story. They have to." The wind carried the smell of rain again. Somewhere far away, the war still raged across oceans and islands. But in that desolate camp, surrounded by death, the embers of humanity glowed faintly, small flickering lights in the endless dark. And those embers, fragile though they were, refused to die. The monsoon clouds rolled in over the Philippines, heavy with rain and remembrance. The year was 1945, and the world had turned again. Japan's empire, once a rising sun burning across the Pacific, was collapsing in smoke and ruin. But for the survivors of Bataan, the war's end was not triumph, it was release. They emerged from prison camps, from hidden jungles, from the very edge of humanity, carrying scars too deep for words. The road from Mariveles to Camp O'Donnell still haunted their dreams. Every step, every corpse, every thirsting breath on that march was carved into memory. When the Allied forces finally returned, led by General Douglas MacArthur's solemn vow, "I shall return," the ghosts of Bataan were waiting. They were not soldiers anymore. They were living testaments to what war can do to the human soul. Their eyes, hollow yet fierce, told stories that no history book could fully hold. Liberation came with joy, but also with reckoning. The world soon learned the full horror of what had happened on that 65-mile stretch of road. Testimonies poured in, from Americans, from Filipinos, from witnesses who had buried the dead in secret. The Bataan Death March was no longer just a battlefield tragedy. It was a war crime. In 1946, in Manila, the victors held tribunals. Japanese commanders responsible for the atrocities faced justice before the world. Some tried to claim ignorance, that the brutality was the work of rogue guards. But the survivors knew better. The system itself had demanded cruelty, born from a twisted sense of honor that turned surrender into shame. Several of the officers were found guilty. Some were executed. Others lived out their days in prison, haunted by the ghosts of those they had condemned to die under the sun. Yet justice, though served, could not bring peace to the survivors. Many never spoke of what they had endured. Some returned home to parades and flags, but found no words for what they had seen. The laughter of crowds felt hollow against the memory of the screams. Families rejoiced, then grieved again when they realized the men who returned were not the same as the ones who had left. In the Philippines, the memory of Bataan became a wound and a symbol. Each year, in the quiet towns of Luzon, bells toll on April 9th, Araw ng Kagitingan, the Day of Valor. Survivors gather with children and grandchildren, telling the story once more, ensuring it is never forgotten. For them, remembrance is not about vengeance. It is about warning. At dawn on those commemorations, the road from Mariveles to San Fernando stands empty. The jungle has reclaimed much of it. Vines cover the rusted trucks and fallen helmets. Birds sing where soldiers once fell. But if you walk the route, you can still feel the silence, the kind that carries weight, that presses against your chest like unseen hands. In the distance, the ghosts walk still. The gaunt silhouettes of men in torn uniforms, the sound of boots on gravel, the whisper of prayers carried by the wind. Each step they take is a reminder of what happens when humanity forgets itself. For the Americans, Bataan became a lesson in endurance. For the Filipinos, it became a symbol of shared sacrifice. Together, they had faced the unimaginable and proven that courage is not always found in victory. It often lives in survival. After the war, new nations rose from the ashes of the old empires. The Philippines gained full independence. The United States rebuilt, but the shadow of Bataan lingered. Veterans' hospitals filled with men who still woke screaming in the night, their throats dry from dreams of thirst. Many could not forgive. Others chose not to forget. And somewhere in Japan, some of the former guards, now old and broken, carried their own shame. A few sought out survivors to apologize. Most could not bear to speak. History had marked them too with the same indelible scar. Decades passed, and yet the story of Bataan refused to fade. It lived on in the eyes of those who remembered. The last survivors at reunions, their medals dull with time, their hands trembling as they saluted the fallen. They told their stories not for glory, but for truth, because silence, they knew, was the greatest enemy of all. Today, the Bataan Death March is remembered not just as an atrocity, but as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. The road that once swallowed lives now bears plaques and monuments. Schools teach the story, museums preserve the relics. Yet no memorial, no book, no film can capture what it truly meant to be there, to feel the heat, to hear the cries, to walk beside death and keep moving. The ghosts of Bataan do not ask for tears, they ask for memory. They ask that the world never again forgets how quickly honor can be twisted into cruelty, how easily humanity can be lost when power goes unchecked. As the sun sets over the fields of Pampanga and the hills of Bataan, a golden light cuts through the fading jungle. It touches the ground where men once fell, where rivers once ran red, where courage and despair walked hand in hand. The war is long over, but the echo remains. Because history does not end when the guns fall silent. It lives in the choices we make after the silence. And so, the story of Bataan stands as both warning and remembrance, a reminder that even in the darkest march, the human spirit can endure. That valor is not in conquest, but in compassion, that every life lost on that road carries a message still worth hearing. To remember Bataan is to remember us all, our capacity for cruelty, for courage, and for redemption. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.